But I feel like underneath this, and what I wanted to ask you was, certainly it's sad that these guys' stories are being kind of swept under the rug in a way that's most accessible to many people, because we were talking about how some games or many games have failed, right, to tell a compelling story. Many of them don't. I often think about the original Medal of Honor on PS1 as being one of those games that actually really did try. It was so good, when you're showing your papers and all that kind of stuff. And obviously games like Papers, Please take a more serious slant on the almost Schindler's List type fascist activity that might be going on. But I feel like this game is not being given a fair shake to add positively to the commentary because it's already being character assassinated. Does that strike you as unfair?
Yeah. So in terms of like war portrayal, have you ever seen a movie called Restrepo?
No, it sounds familiar.
Restrepo is a documentary that came out a couple years ago about the war in Afghanistan. Two journalists kind of just follow a group of soldiers in Afghanistan for a year. And what's striking about that movie is it's the best part about that movie. I always point people to when they're like, what's Afghanistan like? Blah, blah. Like I always say, just watch Restrepo, right? Because those guys, they're not Navy SEALs, whatever. They're very normal soldiers. And like the movie kind of like advertises, it's the most hostile part of Afghanistan. It's like, yeah, but like Afghanistan, the war is weird because like everyone kind of goes to one of three spots. So like everyone's in the most, if you're fighting, you're in the most hostile part of Afghanistan. Afghanistan is a relatively safe country, geographic percentage wise. All the fighting's in like a handful of spots.
Like Kabul or something.
Kabul's relatively, I mean, there's action there, but it's mostly relegated to the eastern border where Pakistan is.
Oh, interesting. Well, that makes sense.
And a handful of provinces, Kunar and Paktika, and in the South Helmand, where most of the European military is at.
Was that where one of those locations where Bin Laden was captured? Because he was captured in Pakistan, right? Along.
Correct. They launched the operation from a place called Jalalabad Airfield, which is in Afghanistan, but they captured him in Pakistan.
I love that. It's so badass. Maybe illegal, but still badass nonetheless. Now.
Yeah. But that's a great. But if you watch that movie, if you're like, I want to do the accurate war thing, I don't. It makes a good documentary, but if you I challenge people to watch it, and I'm like, I don't think actual warfare makes a good movie, and it sounds weird because most warfare is really boring. Like separated with like it's really boring. I've eaten a Pop-Tart in the middle of a firefight, like. It's really boring, and it's intermixed with like intense action. But it's like really, it could last a long time. I've had firefights last 5 hours. I've had them last 5 seconds. I told you I've been in one I didn't know. So I don't know. It'll take a creative person to make the game that captures that well. I like Battlefield because it captures the audio really well, and that's what's really important. But going back to how it's portrayed. We gave civilians of Fallujah days to evacuate, and they did. Roughly 90% of them evacuated. And then after that, we were very clear every male left would be considered hostile. This goes back to war being ugly and terrible, and I don't want to excuse anything, but a 10-year-old can pick up an AK, and I've seen it. And it's terrible. But that's what the reality was on the ground. But I do think the game needs a fair shot. And if you're following a specific group of guys, like, again, we don't know how many white phosphorus rounds were shot, who did it, where, I don't know. And I really can't find anything on that other than it happened. But was it like 2 guys that shot 2 rounds? Was it like really aggressively used? And if this specific group of guys just didn't use it, like, then it's just not part of the story. You know what I mean?
Well, that was kind of what I was thinking too. And I also feel like it robs them of their own, not that they're owed like this platform, but they're being given a platform to tell their story, and they're almost being robbed of it. And I think the biggest thing that they're being robbed of, because we're making fun of Call of Duty and all that, and we should.
Yeah.
From a trivial nature. I mean, they're fun games, but there's no doubt in my mind that many people played Call of Duty World at War or Cold War or World War II and had no idea what the USSR was or what Market Garden was or any of those things, right? And then they go look. And I feel like just by by trivializing and making it almost into a comedy or a game that shouldn't exist in its current form, it robs consumers and players, curious players, of the possibility of being exposed to something that they would have otherwise not been exposed to. Because if they're not going to get their World War II information in a video game, many people are not going to get it at all, or they're not going to be interested in investigating. And it's not to say that Sledgehammer should be your teacher. It's just to say that this is a good stepping off point to be like, what happened in Fallujah? Maybe someone will play 6 Days in Fallujah and be like, this isn't adequate and we need to do better. But the very existence of it existing is offensive. And that to me is a huge problem, not only because it's offensive to our boys and women, I guess, I assume women were there too, that definitely fought. It trivializes their concept of sacrifice and what they did. And I'm just going to be real, like, as Americans, I'm more interested in their story. Yeah. You know, like, just inherently, like, it's not to say I'm not interested in other people's stories, but they were our people, and I would rather none of our people died there. Yeah. You know, so I don't know. Does that make sense to you? I feel like people are being robbed of it's almost like, well, do this calculus, but you don't even know how to add. You don't even know that adding exists, you know, and that to me is frustrating. Yeah,
it's not to say that a more complicated story can't be better. I'll go to the We Were Soldiers thing, where I rewatched that movie pretty recently, and it's a much more complicated movie than I remembered it, where that movie undoubtedly says the Viet Cong was a hard enemy to fight, and they were violent, and we had to be violent back. But I remember it as an action movie, but when I watch it back, it keeps cutting back to the Viet Cong. It keeps cutting back to one of their leaders, pointing at maps, saying, attack the Americans here and everything. And it keeps cutting back to Mel Gibson's character, him doing maneuvers, telling his guys what to do. So it's having these two leaders, it's humanizing them. But then it keeps going back to these scenes. It goes back to this Viet Cong guy with a diary, with a photo of his wife. And it goes back to these scenes of them honoring their dead or being sad. They have moments where they're celebrating fighting the Americans and their victory. They're scared of what we're doing. But it never gets to the point where it's sympathetic to them either. And it's like a weird anti-American movie. So I think there's a place for that. And it depicts a lot of horrors, like our use of napalm and how we called it on our own people because of how close we had to call those bombs, and it killed them and it killed us at the same time. And then you look at a movie like Black Hawk Down, which is what I think this game is trying to do, which is a very like get after it kind of like let's go get the bad guys.
Yeah, something linear, you know,
something linear, and it depicts urban combat's horrifying. And here's all the things that can go wrong, but it doesn't get into so our failure in Somalia impacted our failure to react in Rwanda during that genocide, because they said, wow, we had this failed battle in Somalia, we're done with Africa, right?
Yeah, which is such a shame. Rwanda is one of the only places we probably should have gone in the last 30 years.
Yeah, that's one of those we look back and foreign intervention might have been the answer, but we didn't, because we lost so many people in Somalia trying to go after this warlord that was using hunger as a weapon and committing his own genocide, and we lost like 24 people.
Yeah, and then USS Cole happens, and then 9/11, and we're just taught we're flat-footed. It's very interesting, Steve, because I love the idea. Something they said in the FAQ for the game I thought was kind of, I understand it, but they were saying like there's no time in the game, even in multiplayer, where you'll play as the insurgents, and I'm like, we're starting small and we're thinking small, but people aren't bringing it to the nth degree, which is like, well, why can't we tell the story of Fallujah from the insurgents' point of view? You know, like this is the kind of, but we have to start somewhere where we can all grasp it first. And we're not even giving people the opportunity to be like, well, we've never really told an Iraq war game, you know, apart from like Conflict Desert Storm and all these weird old tactical shooters, which are great, but we never really did anything like this. And we have to remember that Fallujah, 6 Days in Fallujah was so in context to what happened that it was so offensive to people. But I just feel like we have this rife conflict of story that can be told in stories. And by the way, when I said linear before, I mean in terms of the game, but I really mean in terms of the storytelling, right? Like we're telling a linear story that, like you said, everything that happened in Somalia in '94, for instance, was like you need congressional hearings and books
there's a political way to tell Black Hawk Down, and then there's the action movie way, and I think there's space for. They're both great.
Exactly.
You could do Band of Brothers without the scene they encountered the Holocaust. You got Saving Private Ryan, going again, another Holocaust reference that doesn't really reference it. It has a very small reference to it. Like every movie or game can't necessarily encompass the whole conflict or anything like that. Not to suggest it can't be better if it doesn't make itself a little deeper, but this movie's on the squad level. This squad, I'm assuming, let's just make an assumption for argument's sake that these guys didn't use any white phosphorus or anything like that. It's just not on their level, and they're just worried about being alive the next day. And I think
that's an interesting story. That's an interesting story.